recently attended a steampunk wedding, and being a bit of a steampunk myself, I've got plenty of clothes and costume pieces and bits of kit to actually kit myself up to look the part. The missus doesn't, however, so I said that I would make her a steampunk bracer to add to her outfit for the event. I've made a fair few steampunk bracers and gauntlets in my time, so I've done a fair bit of leather work previously. But this one's going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be a little bit less functional. There aren't going to be any lights in here and fewer sort of sci-fi elements. This is going to be a little bit more decorative, so I'm going to try and come up with something that looks quite elegant. Something that I found quite useful when doing this is these curved stencils. You can get them from art shops, and they've got some nice flowing curves which are quite useful when you're trying to come up with a design. So what I'm going to do is to trace out a design on some paper and then cut that out, and then I'm going to transfer that onto some veg tan leather and cut out some pieces. In order to get a symmetrical pattern here, what I'm doing is folding the paper in half, cutting it out so that I get a nice symmetrical design on both sides. In order to trace that onto the leather, what I'm using is a needle which is held in a vice grip. So instead of actually marking the leather with a pen or pencil, which probably will show through the leather dye when I'm done, the needle instead allows me to create an impression in the leather, which will then disappear once I've cut along it. And I'm just using a Stanley knife to cut out the design here. Because my design has some fairly small concave curves in it, what I'm using is a hole punch to cut out the hole in advance. I find that you get a smoother curve if you do that rather than trying to cut it out by hand. Positioning is very important here, because obviously if you cut this out wrong, you're not going to be able to come back from any mistakes. So spend plenty of time trying to actually line these up correctly, because it really will pay off in the long run. So there's my pieces cut out, and hopefully you can roughly see how that's going to sit on the arm. So the next thing to do is to smooth out the edges and to cut some decorative lines along the edge. So what I'm doing again is using my needle in a vice grip, and I'm just guiding that by holding my finger against the side of the leather. What this is doing is just adding in some decorative detail along the edge. What I'm also doing is using the end of the vice grip just to smooth out the edge. When you cut it with a Stanley knife, you'll find that it leaves quite a sharp edge. But if you wet the leather and then just smooth it down with something with a nice soft edge to it, it will sort of soften that down and make it less sharp. And I'm just repeating the same process for all of the pieces of the leather. So hopefully you can see that that just leaves a nice edge to the pieces. And that's how they're going to sit together. So the next stage is for me to actually add some detailing to this, and for that I've got some leather stamps. Now if you're a professional leather worker, I'm sure you'd probably tool this in by hand, but I'm not a leather worker, as you can probably tell, so I'm going to use some stamps just to add some decorative detail to this. So the way to do that is to wet the leather again, which just makes it a little bit more supple. Then I can start punching in some detail with the stamps. Now again, positioning is everything with this, so take as much time as you need to actually get this lined up correctly. And using a ruler or some other straight edge is definitely recommended, just to make sure that everything lines up nicely. Once you've stamped some detail into this, there's not really any way of getting it back out again, so you do need to make sure that you've got everything lined up correctly. Now I generally don't tend to plan these things ahead, so I just sort of keep adding detail until I come up with something that looks decent. So as you can see, I've used a variety of stamps here, and I think that looks quite nice. I've often found that the more detail you add, the more that the individual elements sort of get lost in the overall look of the piece. It's also worth saying that once the leather is dyed, some of these details will be hidden to an extent. So even if you do feel that you've gone a little bit too far, or maybe some of the things aren't quite positioned correctly, you probably will find that once you've added some leather dye and other decorations, you'll find that the whole thing comes together. Another tip is actually to put some marks in the leather ahead of time, spaced out evenly, so that you can find exactly where you need to put your stamps. So that's what I'm doing here, just putting some points in with the needle, and that's just allowing me to get my stamps lined up correctly. So there we go. Obviously there's some large areas on the top of the shape here. I'm leaving those blank because I'm planning to put some brass plate on there. So I now need to join these up, and obviously leather's quite tough, so sewing it can be quite difficult. Certainly for a normal sewing machine, I don't think that that would be able to punch through the leather. So I'm sewing this up by hand, and in order to do that and make things easier for myself, what I'm doing is to pre-punch some holes in the leather ahead of time. So when I actually come to sew it up, the holes are already there, and that should actually make it quite easy. So I've now sewed all that together, and I'm at this stage now where I can dye the leather. So what I've done is to give it a layer of water just to slightly wet the leather, and I'm using Phoebing's leather dye, which I'm watering down, and I'm just applying some thin layers to the leather. So as you can see, I'm moving quite quickly here. And the reason I'm doing that is because if you leave the dye on there for too long, you'll find that it sinks in and leaves some noticeable marks. So what I'm doing is to thin the leather dye down, so it's quite watery, and I'm applying the layers to it quite quickly, so it doesn't have time to sit there and fully absorb in. That way I can hopefully get a nice even application all the way across the leather. Because this is watered down, if I think the colour is a little bit too gentle, I can then come back in, give it another pass and slowly build up the colour. That's better than putting neat dye straight on there, because you will find that it goes very dark very quickly, so much easier to build it up slowly rather than just to go in straight away and get something very, very dark that perhaps hides some of the detail that you spent all that time putting in. So I've left it for a few hours now for the dye to dry. What I'm now doing is coming in with some black resin. This almost works like an antiquing effect, so what's going to happen is that the black resin flows into the details that I've stamped into the leather and should highlight all of those details. And as you can see, I'm actually wiping some of it off so that the black resin is left in the detail but isn't quite as strong in the other areas of the piece. You can wipe this off just with a damp cloth if you're quick. So what I generally do is to apply a little bit, wipe it off, apply again, just so that it doesn't overpower the piece and I can get the effect that I want. So I've now let that dry as well, and the final stage here is to add some clear acrylic resin. This basically acts like a varnish, so you'll get a nice shiny finish to the leather once you're done. So I'm now at a stage where I can start adding in some rivets. Now rivets are often used to hold things together, but they can also be decorative elements too. So what I'm doing is using a hole punch to put some holes in the edge of the leather, and I'm also using a drill to drill some holes in the centre at the points where the hole punch can't quite reach. What I'm using is cap rivets, so what you do is you put the stem through the back of the leather, put the cap on the top, then you can either crunch it down with some pliers or with a hammer. So in this case I'm really just applying rivets at certain points to add a bit of decoration. Because I've sewed it all together I don't really need to rivet it, nevertheless they do look quite nice at certain points in the design. So what I need now is some straps to actually attach the piece to the arm. So what I'm doing is just to cut out some strips of leather here. I'm just sizing those so that they fit the buckles that I'm using. So I'm now ready to cut out some pieces of brass to attach to the leather. What I've done is to make a paper template just to make sure that I've got the size correct, and I'm now using that to trace out the design on some brass sheet. Now I'm cutting this out on the bandsaw, but if you don't have access to a bandsaw, you can actually use scissors to cut out brass, which is something that I used to do for years. Now you can't really do it for stuff that's 1mm thick or above, but if you get 0.6mm brass sheet, I found that that's very easy to cut with a decent pair of scissors, so don't worry if you don't have access to bench tools or anything like that. There are other ways to cut it out. So that seems to fit well enough on the piece. So what I've now done is to drill some holes into both pieces, and that's going to be where the rivets will go, which will hold this in place. Now because the bracer's got a bit of a curve to it, I'm just using a piece of pipe here to bend the brass sheet into shape. And they fit quite nicely in place. So again, I've used a hole punch and a drill to put holes in the correct points. I'm now bashing in some rivets. As you can see, I've also attached the straps to the piece as well, and I've just attached those with some rivets too. So the final thing to do is just to cover the interior. Obviously you can see all of my stitches and the backs of the rivets and things like that. Often doesn't matter too much because it will be covered by your arm anyway, but a little bit of padding just so that it doesn't irritate the arm is probably a good idea. So I'm just using some 1mm foam to do that. So there's my final piece. Looks quite nice. I think it's a bit less techy than some of the previous ones I've done. There's a few less gadgets and gizmos on it, but it is slightly more decorative, so I think that looks quite nice. So I hope that's useful if you're thinking of making some steampunk items yourself. But in the meantime, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.